Hi, this is our second video on the true meaning of the 10 toes, the 10 horns, and the 10 kings. Now, we're going to skip Daniel 2 and we're going to come back to Daniel 2 later on in this series. So in today's video, we're going to look at the 10 horns and the little horn found in Daniel's chapter 7 and 8. Are you ready? Let's get to it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to buckle up because what I'm going to reveal to you today, I believe, is going to revolutionize the way that you see Daniel 7 and 8 and ultimately the whole book of Daniel. You see, as a Seventh-day Adventist, most of us were taught the meaning of the 10 horns through the interpretation that was told by Uriah Smith. His view of Daniel 7 is that the fourth beast represented the pagan Roman Empire. The 10 horns represented 10 Germanic tribes that rose up in the western portion of Rome, and the little horn represented the papacy. So in this prophecy, when Daniel saw the 10 horns and saw 3 of them being subdued by the little horn, this is how Uriah Smith interpreted this prophecy. He says, this little horn, as we shall have occasion to notice more fully hereafter, was the papacy. The 3 horns plucked up before it were the Heruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. And the reason why they were plucked up was because they were opposed to the arrogant claims of the papal hierarchy and hence to the supremacy in the church of the Bishop of Rome. Now, according to Smith, here's how the papacy destroyed the Heruli. Zeno, the emperor of the East and friend of the Pope, was anxious to drive Odoacer out of Italy. He goes on to say, Theodoric had come to the throne of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and Zeno gave him permission to march against Odoacer and take possession of Italy. Accordingly, after 3 years' war, the Herulian kingdom in Italy was overthrown. Here's how he says the papacy destroyed the Vandals. When the Catholics were thus feeling the restraining power of an Arian king in Italy, they were suffering a violent persecution from the Arian Vandals in Africa. He continues, such was the position of affairs when in 533, Justinian entered upon his Vandal and Gothic wars. Wishing to secure the influence of the Pope and the Catholic party, he issued the memorable decree which was to constitute the Pope the head of all the churches. Continuing, he says, but no decree of this nature could be carried into effect until the Arian horns which stood in its way were plucked up. The Vandals fell before the victorious arms of Belisarius in 534. And finally, here's how he says the papacy destroyed the Ostrogoths. The edict of Emperor Justinian, dated AD 533, made the Bishop of Rome the head of all the churches. But this edict could not go into effect until the Arian Ostrogoths, the last of the 3 horns that were plucked up to make room for the papacy, were driven from Rome. And this was not accomplished, as already shown, till AD 538. So essentially what Uriah Smith is suggesting is that the 3 horns that were subdued by the little horn were the 3 Germanic tribes that were opposed to the papacy's doctrines. And those 3 tribes, according to him, were the Heruli in 493, the Vandals in 534, and the Ostrogoths in 538. Now, this interpretation of the 10 horns and the little horn is believed by, I would guess, 95% of Seventh-day Adventists. You're going to see this in most of our prophecy books. You're going to hear this in our Daniel and Revelation seminars. I myself have believed this. I've taught this. I've argued for it. However, it's not until recently, once I asked the Lord to give me the true understanding of this prophecy, that I believe God is now giving us the correct meaning of the 10 horns in the book of Daniel. And it was then that I realized that the 3 horns that were subdued by the little horn could not be the Vandals, Heruli, and Ostrogoths. Let me show you why. According to Daniel 7:24, the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. Now let me ask you a question. Is there anything in Uriah Smith's interpretation that would remotely suggest that it was the papacy that actually subdued these 3 Germanic tribes? The Ostrogoths and the Vandals were destroyed by Emperor Justinian, who, among other reasons, wanted to relieve them of Catholic persecution. However, Emperor Justinian isn't the papacy. Emperor Justinian was the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. So let me ask you a question. If your family is persecuted and someone comes and beats up the persecutor, is that the same thing as you beating up the persecutor? And the Horelli were destroyed by a friend of the Pope, who was actually the ruler of another fellow Germanic tribe. So let me ask you a question. If a friend of a friend robbed a store, is that the same thing as you robbing the store? Ladies and gentlemen, the first problem that we should have with Uriah Smith's interpretation is that it wasn't the papacy that subdued these three kingdoms. Now, the second problem that I have is, according to Daniel 7:24, the little horn rose up after the 10 horns. Now, if the papacy rose up in 538, how is the papacy destroying the Herodian tribe in 493 and the Vandal tribe in 534? You see, on the surface, it makes sense that the 10 horns in Daniel 7 represents 10 Germanic tribes. And on the surface, it also makes sense that those three subdued horns were the Herodians, Vandals, and Ostrogoths. But when we pull back the layers and really examine this prophecy against what we have traditionally believed, we must understand that this prophecy, the interpretation that we believe, doesn't match the true context of Daniel's vision. Now, before you think that I'm trying to undermine Uriah Smith or I'm trying to place myself above Uriah Smith, let me be clear with you. Uriah Smith knew more prophecy in his pinky finger than I'll probably ever know. This video is not to place myself on a higher pedestal than Uriah Smith or try to make a name for myself within the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This video is about us getting down to the true meaning of the 10 horns, because I believe that God wants us to understand all the intricacies of the prophecies, even the ones that are not salvific. And this is why you must understand that the 10 horns found in the book of Daniel represents the 10 kingships that have ruled the world prior to the Roman Empire. And if you remember, these 10 kingships were the kings of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and the 4 divisions that arose after Alexander the Great, which were Macedonia, Asia Minor, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the Seleucid Empire. And if you need further confirmation that these 10 horns are the kingships of the world superpowers prior to the Roman Empire, all you have to do is read Daniel chapter 8, and it tells you exactly who they are. Notice what Daniel 8 verse 20 says. It says, "The ram which thou sawest, having 2 horns, are the kings of Media and Persia." Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have to guess who the horns are. Daniel 8 is telling us. Notice what the next verse says. "And the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king." That's Alexander the Great. Verse 22 says, "Now that being broken, whereas 4, which is horns, stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of this nation." And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that those 4 divisions were from Alexander's kingdom, which were Macedonia, Asia Minor, the Ptolemaic Empire, and the Seleucid Empire. So you see, Daniel 8 has mapped out most of these horns already for us. All we need to know and understand is that the 3 previous kingships before Media also represented 1 horn apiece. So the the Babylonian Empire, or the kings of Babylonian, is a horn. The kings of Assyria is a horn, and the kings of Egypt represented a horn as well. Now the question is, who are the 3 horns plucked up by the little horn? And in order for you to understand this answer, we first must determine who is the little horn. Now, if you want to understand who the little horn is, listen to what Uriah Smith says regarding the little horn of Daniel 8. He says, "This little horn must be understood to symbolize Rome in its entire history, including its 2 phases, pagan and papal." Uriah Smith is right on the money, guys. The only problem that I have with this is Uriah Smith seems to back away from this premise when he comes to interpreting Daniel chapter 7. You see, what God revealed to me was that the little horn and the 10 horns represents the same entities across Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. So if the little horn in Daniel chapter 8 represents both phases, pagan and papal Rome, then the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 represents the same thing. And if the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 8 represents the kingships of the world's ruling superpowers, then the 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7 represents the same thing. You see, the same thing we as Adventists accuse the evangelicals of doing, we're doing the exact same thing. We say that if the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 represents the papacy, well then it can't represent Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel chapter 8. Well, in that same fashion, how can the horns represent the kingships of the world's superpowers in Daniel 8, but represent 10 Germanic tribes in Daniel chapter 7? And you see, what I'm about to show you is that Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8 are giving us the same narrative across both chapters. You just didn't realize it until now. Daniel 8 verse 8 and 9 says, "Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land." In Daniel 8, we see 4 horns rising up towards the 4 winds. And out of one of them, a little horn would rise. Now, evangelicals believe that a horn comes out of a horn, but we know better than that. It is evident to us that the little horn came out of one of those 4 winds. We understand that when Alexander the Great died, his kingdom fell into civil war, and there was strife in the north, south, east, and west. And we must understand is that those winds represents the 4 compass directions where war was coming from. And we also must understand is that the little horn would rise up out of one of those compass directions. And to understand which compass direction the little horn would rise from, all we would need to understand is which compass direction Rome came from. Everyone should know that Rome originated from what we know today as Italy, and Italy is west of Greece. So when Rome came on the scene, it came from that western wind. And when it arose out of the western wind, it conquered the horn that was situated in the west as well. And history reveals that this horn was the Macedonian Empire. History says that Macedonia became a Roman province in 168 BC. Then after rising out of the western wind and conquering the western horn, the Bible says that it would then go towards the south. Although formerly conquered in 30 BC, Rome had begun waxing great to the Ptolemaic Empire somewhere around 80 BC. And the historical record says that after awarding Egypt and Cyrus to Rome, Ptolemy XI was placed on the throne by the Roman general Cornelius Sulla. Listen, if kings are awarding you their kingdoms and you're deciding who sits on the throne, you've already waxed great towards that empire. And finally, Rome conquered the Seleucid Empire in 64 BC. In essence, Rome came out of the west, making Macedonia a Roman province in 168 BC. It then waxed great towards the south when it began usurping its authority over Egypt's monarchy around 80 BC. And then it went towards the east by conquering the Seleucid Empire in 64 BC. Now the question is, originally there were 4 horns, so what happened to the horn that was in the north, which was known as Asia Minor? And what you must understand is that in 281 BC, the Seleucid Empire conquered the Asia Minor Empire. Thus, when Rome conquered the known world, it didn't have to conquer 4 horns, it only had to conquer 3 horns. And yes, in case you didn't realize it, this is the same exact narrative found in Daniel chapter 7 when it says the little horn would subdue 3 horns. The 3 horns were the 3 remaining divisions or 3 remaining kingships of Alexander the Great's kingdom that Rome subdued in order to conquer and become the sole superpower of the world. And now it's starting to make sense. The 10 horns and the little horn are the same entities across Daniel 7 and Daniel chapter 8. And now we no longer need to ponder which powers makes up the 10 horns, nor do we have a scenario where a friend of a friend destroyed the horns. You see, once we understand the identity of the little horn, the identity of the 10 horns becomes clearer. And what you must understand is that Daniel 7's underlying theme is dominion. Notice Medo-Persia was to arise and devour much flesh. Notice dominion was given to Greece. See, the 4th beast was to devour the whole earth. And understand ultimately that this dominion shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Thus, in order to reveal the papacy's original source of its authority, Daniel 7 and 8 zoom in on the little horn, revealing that before the papacy started speaking great words, before it waxed great even to the host of heaven, its pagan predecessors had to first conquer the known world. So yes, the little horn is ultimately the papacy, but we must understand that the papacy had to derive its power from its pagan phase of the little horn, which had to conquer the 3 remaining territories of Alexander the Great's kingdom in order to rule the world. Now, the obvious question is, if the 4th beast represents Rome, how can the little horn represents Rome's kingship if it came up or rose up after the 4th beast was already in existence? And this is why we must understand, repeat, and expand. You see, the subsequent vision helps us with the earlier vision. In other words, if it wasn't for Daniel 7 and 8, some of us would probably place China or Russia as part of the metals of Nebuchadnezzar's image. And this is why repeat and expand is so important, because the later visions give us context for the earlier visions. And thus we understand that Daniel chapter 8 is giving us context for Daniel chapter 7. So even though Daniel chapter 7 appears to give the impression that these 10 horns rose up after pagan Rome was well established, we understand that Daniel chapter 8 expands or expounds upon Daniel chapter 7, and now we can see that these 10 kingships existed prior to the pagan Roman Empire, but only 3 of them were subdued in order for pagan Rome to rule the world. Now, the next logical question is, well, how did the Roman kingship rise up among the 10 horns when clearly most of them had long been destroyed or were no longer in power? Daniel chapter 7:12 answers this question when it says, "As concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their dominion taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and time." What you must understand is that these 10 horns were superseded by the Roman kingship, who ruled parts of their territories that they previously ruled. And though they lost their dominion, their lives are being prolonged. In essence, God is keeping these 10 horns in what I call supernatural suspended animation. And what you must understand is that in the last days, God will bring these 10 kingships back, and they will have a part in prophecy stage. And when you see the next presentation on Daniel chapter 11, you're going to get a better understanding of where these 10 kings arise from. I'm the Seventh-day Adventist Watchman, and you've just learned the true meaning of the 10 horns and the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 and 8.